All right, guys, welcome back to the fifth and final key knowledge dot point of this first outcome of Unit 2. Starting as always with the study design and where this one fits in. So technological and global issues which may affect decision making when establishing a business, such as, and there, the rest of that key knowledge dot point provides us with our script, generating customer databases, contact with overseas suppliers, and contact with overseas retailers. So when we get into this, we're going to kind of go into three different areas. But first off, what's this all about? I guess, look, when you're setting up a business these days, you need to think about a few other things regarding legality. Okay, the impact that technology is going to have on how the impact and how your business interacts with customers, competitors, suppliers. Okay, technology is a huge thing in business these days. Obviously, we need to think about the legality of how you're using that technology to interact with all these various stakeholders, and then also impact on the global environment might have if you choose to operate internationally in any way. So, for example, selling to overseas markets or buying resources from overseas. And we looked at that, just a couple of videos ago. Now, this is quite complex, but the study design, like I said, really kind of simplifies this down for us. Okay, and it just gives us three areas to focus on. This idea of the customer databases, overseas suppliers and retailers. So we're taking a huge kind of area, and we're just going to focus on the three things just to simplify it for the purposes of this course. Okay, those are the three we're going to look at. So first off, customer databases. There's a definition for you. If you had to define customer database, organized collection of data, blah, 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 blah. It's pretty straightforward. Why do businesses collect information on their customers? Lots of reasons. Here's a few of them. Look, it allows the business to make decisions about what products are working best for them. They can be used to come up with marketing strategies that they can then use to attract newer potential customers. Allows a business to target individuals with very specific marketing information. And it also provides information about when discounts should be offered. Actually, talking about those last couple there, and in fact, going back to that cartoon that you see at the bottom of that one, don't worry, it's only marketers collecting our personal data so they can create more relevant advertising for us. Look, that when I saw that reminded me, look, Australia has kind of been a bit behind a lot of other countries when it comes to all of this customer database stuff. But my last few years of living in the UK, 2003 to 2005, look, I was living in a flat with a flatmate in North London. I was working in central London. So I'd kind of get public transport, get on the tube to go home. And there was a supermarket between the train station I got off at and our flat. And me and my flatmate on a Friday night would usually stop, grab a bottle of wine, grab something for dinner. Usually it was these kind of ready-made curries that are becoming more popular here, but they were really, really good in England. And then we, go home and have a bottle of wine with the curry. And we did this kind of pretty much every Friday. And what was interesting, if I didn't do that, say I went out on the Friday night or we did something different and we didn't make this stop at the supermarket, I'd get text messages from the supermarket basically offering me a deal on those things that I normally bought because it was all linked to my loyalty card. You have Woolies loyalty cards, Coles loyalty cards. Because I would be scanning that as well to build up the points, they had all my, my buying history information, and they would use that to personally target me if they felt they'd lost out on a sales opportunity, and they'd be trying to convince me to go and buy the stuff that I usually buy. Hopefully that makes some kind of sense to you. But Australia now does this to a certain extent as well. So basically, customer databases provide really useful information to businesses that enables them to identify, satisfy customer needs, come up with marketing material, so on and so forth. Now, considerations, this is kind of the key part here. When you are gathering all of this information on your customer database, you need to think about a few things from a legal point of view. How the information is going to be stored. So on what digital system, what database are you going to use? Because there's going to be different options. How are you going to protect that customer information from, getting out, being hacked, being exploited maybe by other businesses. Basically, what this is going to mean that you're going to need some policies and procedures that make sure that you're compliant with the Privacy and the Data Protection Act 2014, Victorian legislation. And you're going to need to make sure that staff training is providing and accessing and using this information. Obviously, only to staff that's relevant for. But basically what we're saying here, this is all around data protection. It's a really, really big issue. If you're collecting and storing information on your customers, you've got to safeguard it. And that piece of legislation is all about how a business does that. Second one, contact with overseas suppliers. Look, an overseas supply, there's a definition for you. Businesses that sell resources you need for your business that are based in another country. We just looked at suppliers a couple of videos ago. So we're kind of, going back to there. So we said in that video, when you're establishing a business, you might need to choose some suppliers, and you might decide to choose some suppliers that are actually overseas. Why might we do this? Again, we touched on this in that video, but just to remind ourselves, access to cheaper resources is the big one. And it also might be that you can access resources that are either not available in Australia or are of a higher quality if they're sourced in another country. But I would say that number one there is really a massive percentage of the time the reason why businesses do this, why they're accessing resources from other nations. This has become much, much more common and also much simpler to do, to be fair, due to globalization. Okay, globalization, I'm not sure if that's a term we came across in Unit 1 or not, but globalization is this idea that trade and technology has kind of made the world a much more connected, interconnected, and interdependent place. We now trade on a global scale, if you go back, 30, 40 years, there was much less globalization. And a lot of this is to do with technology. Businesses tend to operate more within their own borders. But because of this increase in globalization, there is much more trade between countries. The technology kind of allows that to happen much more easily. So there's many, many more businesses now that are, if not selling overseas, or at least accessing supplies from overseas. So this is a much more common thing now. And I guess that's why this has been built into the study design, because if you're ever going to be a sound business, this is something you kind of need to be looking into. Considerations here, like we just did considerations for the last one. First off, you have to realize that we can't just deal with businesses in any other country we choose. There needs to be some agreements between countries. They're called free trade agreements. And the Australian government is constantly kind of increasing the list of different nations that we can trade with on a kind of free and simple basis, reducing the regulation when that trade is done. So you need to think about the ability to actually trade with the countries that you're looking at sourcing supplies from. You need to think about the cost of shipping the supplies back to Australia. And while you might be able to access cheaper supplies in another country, once you've then paid for them to be shipped back down here, is the overall cost now more than if you'd have got them from within Australia maybe. So again, you need to balance all that up. And again, thinking about language and time zone differences, we mentioned that when we're looking at supplies as well. Contact with overseas retailers. An overseas retailer, there's a definition for you: businesses that sell goods and services directly to customers overseas. Smiggle is a great example of an awesome Australian business now, smashing goals in lots of other countries now around the world. And again, the increase of globalization has seen an increase in competition with other international businesses. So even if you're operating just within Australia, you're often now competing not just with other Australian businesses, but with businesses based all over the world. And if you think about retail, those overseas businesses don't even need to have a physical presence here in Australia. They could sell via their own website to Australian customers, or they can have an Amazon shop front, lots of different ways to do this. So again, this is this idea of globalization. All businesses now are competing on a global scale, kind of whether you like it or not. But on the flip side of that, it also means it's now much easier for Australian businesses to sell to overseas customers as well. So, it's give and take here. There's positives to this and there's negatives. So considerations you need to think about if you're going to engage in this contact with overseas retailers. Look, number one, it gives you access to a much broader customer base via those retailers than if you were just operating kind of on an Australian scale. You do need to think about the legal government restrictions and regulations in those different nations. So that becomes a much more complex process. Not only now are you dealing with Australian law, you also need to have an understanding of the regulations and the laws in those countries with which you are going to be dealing. You need to think about the expectations of those retailers. And again, that might vary from nation to nation. And as we talked about in a previous video as well, when we're looking at suppliers, you need to think about the social responsibility of those retailers, particularly in nations that do not have a good track record when it comes to, looking after their employees, that don't have much legal regulation as we do in Australia around protecting employees' rights, pay, working conditions, all that sort of stuff. So again, it's something else you need to be kind of building into your equation and thinking about. And that is it. A nice quick one for you. That wraps up Key Knowledge 5, and it also wraps up the entire outcome. I'll see you back here when we move into the second outcome of Unit 2. Cheers for now.